Hey everybody, my name's Andy. I'm the head of ecosystem at Forta. Sound okay? You guys good? Danny, everybody can hear me? Perfect. Okay. So great presentation on stablecoins. I'm going to transition the conversation and talk about security, cybersecurity, and specifically why firewalls are kind of the future of Web3 security. I want to actually start and kind of frame this discussion by talking about something that happened late last week. I assume everyone here is familiar with the attack that happened on Friday. Bybit, a large exchange, was exploited by some North Korean attackers who, among other things, were able to compromise a multi-sig front end and use a malicious transaction to sort of get assets out of cold storage into a hot wallet and then moved off the exchange. This was frustrating to watch for a couple reasons. One, it's the latest in a long line of exploits in this industry. But two, things like this can be detected in real time and prevented if you're sort of taking proper measures. The other thing that happens after events like this too is that crypto Twitter mobilizes really quickly and starts to monitor the stolen funds as they get laundered, across the chain and into other assets and swapped for stable coins and bridged onto other chains, et cetera. And so the exact same thing happened after the Bybit attack. Watching this happen and unfold in real time is also really frustrating too, because we know that these transactions are going to happen. We're watching them happen in real time. If this was happening on traditional financial rails, all of these transactions that Zach XBTC is highlighting here would be blocked, right? No bank would accept these types of transfers because that they're malicious and they involve stolen funds, right? We have the same knowledge of the transaction activity in the space. We just don't have the mechanisms in place to block those malicious transactions, at least not yet. So this is where threat detection starts to enable things like firewalls. So when I talk about threat detection, I'm talking about the process of identifying and analyzing potentially malicious or anomalous transactions. Ideally, you want to do it in real time and use a combination of heuristics and AI and machine learning to help with that. So, little historical context here. At Forta, we've been doing threat detection for the better part of 4 years. In November 2021, when we started, threat detection in Web3 was virtually non-existent, totally sucked. There were a few security shops that were doing it in-house, but it was not a service or a tool that was available to you as an exchange or a DeFi protocol or a rollup. Last year when I gave a similar presentation about using AI for threat detection in February 2024, threat detection capabilities were a lot better. In 2025, a year later, actually really, really good now. So there's a lot more AI and machine learning being used to analyze transactions in real time. I'm going to get into exactly how we do that in a little bit. But generally speaking, we can identify most attacks as they're happening. And it's obviously very easy to identify the transactions that are laundering money sort of post-exploit. So this kind of begs a question for the industry to answer, and we're able to identify threats in real time. Protocols and chains now have to wrestle with, if I know that the transaction is malicious, do I want to accept it? This was not a question that teams had to answer 2 years ago because we didn't have as much threat intelligence as we have now. But today, teams do need to ask themselves this question. And when we talk to our users and other application developers and rollups out there, I've never met a team that said no, they didn't want to block that transaction. So practically speaking, I think there's general consensus that preventing exploits and preventing post-exploit money laundering is a good thing, regardless of the censorship-resistant themes out there. So this leads to the natural conclusion here is let's build firewalls to block these transactions the same way we block a lot of malicious activity on the internet using Web2 firewalls. So real quick, just to kind of anchor what we're doing at Forta, kind of in the context of broader firewall innovation. Firewalls have been around in Web2 for 30 plus years. They've gone through a number of sort of innovation cycles. Started out in the early 90s, sort of early internet, doing like basic packet filtering. Absolutely no machine learning at all. It was very rudimentary. Fast forward to 2020s, and we're using a lot of machine learning to analyze network and application traffic. So in Web3, we get the benefit of the state of the art. We get to start with machine learning and AI. So we're sort of fast forwarding to the current state of the last 30 years of firewall innovation. So let's talk about kind of how we plug into. I'm going to use a roll-up example too, just to kind of paint a picture of where firewalls fit in. So one way to plug in a firewall, and we can do this because most roll-ups today are centralized. There's usually a single provider too that's running their RPC and their sequencer. We call these roll-up as a service providers or RAS providers. So there's an entity that we can go to plug into that chain. So we wrap ourselves around the RPC, and we route transaction activity up to the firewall. So we get all the transaction details. We screen it in real time. We will usually generate a risk score for that transaction. So we're screening for a combination of security and compliance risks. And then we pass that score back to the RPC, and that transaction can get dropped if it's too high risk. And if it's okay, it'll get passed to the sequencer and into a block. We can also move one step down in the transaction flow. We can plug into the sequencer using a proxy and screen there too. But the flow and the work happening behind the scenes is exactly the same. All right, so current state, plugging into those two areas. I think long term, we expect roll-ups to decentralize over time. I know base roll-ups is sort of a hot topic today, and a lot of the large L2s, Arbitrum, Optimism, Base, et cetera, have sort of signaled their support for moving to a base roll-up model in the future, which will allow for more decentralized block building. So in that future, firewalls can plug in directly to the builder or the validator, and you can do all the security screening there. Okay, so a little bit more on how this detection works. So what we do on the back end when we get a transaction is we're going to simulate it. We want to understand what the result of that transaction is. And simulating will flatten that transaction out so we can see all the logs and all the traces. So we need all that context. And we'll take that and we'll pass it into our ML engine. We can also run it against heuristics too, which are just sort of more kind of rigid rules. And we can risk score those transactions. We take a stateless approach to this, meaning we don't look at any other context. We don't look at transaction history from that address. We are only looking at sort of within the confines of that particular transaction because we need to do these checks really fast. If you start looking at other stuff, it slows down the analysis, and in an ideal world, we're running these checks in tens of milliseconds. If you start looking at other contexts, or you start having to make calls to third-party data sources and things like that, you just increase the latency a lot, and it can make something that should happen in 50 milliseconds take 5 seconds. So this is I want to show you guys sort of what it would look like if we were to screen, let's say, a day's worth of transaction activity on an L2. So real quick, what you're seeing here is along the bottom is a risk score from 0 to 1. Closer it is to 1, the higher risk it is. On the left is just the quantity of transactions on a log scale. So you'll see the vast majority of transactions that we screen at the firewall get a 0.0. Normal user behavior, really low risk. Oftentimes just like transferring one digital asset from one wallet to another, a simple ETH transfer, something like that, right? A stablecoin transfer from one address to another. Normal user behavior, really low risk. There's usually going to be a much smaller number of transactions on that chain that are more complicated, higher dollar amounts. There's going to be more risk associated with that. If you see something in the red, we think that's an exploit, and we want to block that transaction. So anything above 0.8, high risk for us, and to the extent we're integrated into the rollup, that transaction would never make it into a block. Here's another test we did over a particular block range on Base back in April. So we did it over this range because we knew there was an exploit that happened in that block range. So similar distribution, you'll see the vast majority of transactions are a 0 on the risk threshold. But there's one that's a 0.9, it looks like. So that was the exploit transaction. So from our standpoint, this is what perfect detection looks like. All the legitimate transactions make it through. The one exploit transaction gets blocked. So we prevent that attack. Okay. Just to sort of highlight the impact that firewalls can have, this is data from sort of Q4 last year. In the red are total value of attacks across those months, and in green are the dollar value of attacks that could have been detected by the firewall. So you'll see vast majority of exploit activity and funds lost could have been caught by the firewall and prevented. So this is why we're so optimistic about security solutions like this. Okay. Historically, because firewalls are a fairly new tool, at least in Web3, the standard approach was if there was an attack, maybe best case you see it in the mempool and you can front run that attack and maybe pause your protocol or rescue those funds. So for the last couple of years, that's been sort of the standard approach. It doesn't always work. You're very susceptible to atomic attacks and private mempool transactions, right? You can't see those, so you can't front run them. It's not very effective on L2s because we don't really have mempools there. And I think the big thing that, I guess the big problem that we saw with pausing is that it just has a much broader kind of impact radius. It affects every user on the protocol or the chain if you're pausing a sequencer. And that's not how we deal with attacks in the real world today, right? We don't shut down a bank because there's a fraudulent transaction, right? You just want to take action against that particular transaction. And that's what we can do with firewalls. So we think firewalls are just a much more effective, a much more scalable, a much more realistic approach to dealing with attacks. Okay, I'm going to end with some predictions for 2025. The first is that in the next 10 months, a firewall will block an exploit transaction. We're just starting to see firewalls get implemented into rollups. And I think over the course of this year, you're going to see a lot more L2s adopt firewalls, both for security and compliance reasons. So first prediction, by the end of the year, a firewall is going to block an exploit. And I think that will be a watershed moment because then we'll have the public proof point that these things are really effective. Second is that firewalls are going to live primarily at the chain level because it's the easiest to integrate there. However, protocol teams will be able to opt in and out at will of different types of screening. So you'll be able to customize exactly what you want to do. Third prediction is that roll-up block building will decentralize. I mentioned this earlier. We think rollups will migrate to more, the based rollup model. However, they'll still be able to preserve the ability to impose different security and compliance rules on the validators and the builders that are in charge of their blocks. And then the last one, firewalls are going to screen the world's on-chain transaction flows, and they're going to do it using AI and ML. So I think we expect, over the next couple of years, firewalls are going to be screening billions of transactions every day on chain, DeFi, et cetera. And it's going to be sort of the same way that firewalls are, an afterthought in Web 2. I expect them to be an afterthought in Web 3 as well, running behind the scenes and, both preventing attacks and sort of helping teams and chains kind of manage their risk. All right, that's it for me, guys. Thank you so much. I'll stick around for a few minutes if anyone has any questions about threat detection or firewalls or security more broadly. Two of my team members are up there in the audience too, so you can grab them if you're interested in chatting more. Thanks again. Have a good week.